This move, e4, immediately stakes a claim in the center, opens diagonals for the queen and bishop, and prepares for rapid development, setting the stage for a wide variety of classical and dynamic opening systems. This move immediately stakes a claim in the center and creates an asymmetrical pawn structure, aiming to imbalance the game and fight for central space, which is characteristic of the popular Sicilian defense. This move initiates the Sicilian defense, aiming to control the center and prepare for an active fight for space by developing a knight towards the queenside. This move, 2, e6, transitions the game into the French defense, establishing a solid pawn chain and preparing to challenge White's central control, albeit with a slight space disadvantage for Black's pieces. This move immediately challenges Black's pawn structure and aims to open lines for White's pieces, a characteristic of many main lines in the open Sicilian. This move resolves the central tension, opening lines for piece development and leading into common variations of the open Sicilian, where White typically aims for rapid development and attacking chances. This move, recapturing the pawn with the knight, enters the classical variation of the Sicilian defense, aiming to maintain central control and develop pieces harmoniously. This move develops a piece, contests the center, and prepares for kingside castling, all while aligning with common lines in the open Sicilian. This move, nb5, is a classic Sicilian defense maneuver, often leading to the challenging Rossolimo variation, aiming to immediately pressure Black's queenside and potentially disrupt their development. This move, d6, reinforces the knight on c6 and prepares to develop the dark-squared bishop, a common response in this Sicilian Taimanov variation, aiming to solidify the pawn structure and open lines for piece activity. This move reinforces White's central pawn majority and prepares to develop the queenside pieces, aiming for a classical pawn structure in the open Sicilian. This move develops a piece, challenges White's central control with the knight, and prepares for kingside castling, a standard approach in the classical variation of the Sicilian defense. This developing move reinforces control over the d5 square and prepares for further pawn advances, or piece development, aiming to challenge Black's central pawn structure. This move, 7, a6, is a key defensive maneuver in the accelerated dragon variation of the Sicilian defense, aiming to challenge White's knight on b5 and prevent it from occupying a strong outpost on c7 or a5. This move continues White's plan to develop pieces and control central squares while relocating the knight to a more active post on the queenside, potentially preparing for kingside play or supporting pawn advances. Developing the bishop to e7 prepares for kingside castling and supports the central pawn structure, while keeping the bishop's diagonal open. This move develops the bishop to a natural square, preparing to castle kingside and connect the rooks, while also supporting the d4 pawn and potentially preparing a future advance of the e-pawn. Castling kingside completes development and secures the king, allowing pieces to enter the game more actively on the queenside or center. Castling kingside solidifies the king's safety, connects the rooks, and prepares for further development in this Sicilian defense variation. This move initiates the fianchetto variation of the accelerated dragon, aiming to control the long diagonal with the bishop and prepare for queenside expansion. This move develops the bishop to a more active diagonal, supporting the d4 pawn and preparing to contest the center more effectively. Developing the bishop to b7 supports the central pawn structure and prepares to put pressure on White's d4 pawn along the long diagonal. The queen moves to a central, active square, aiming to pressure the d6 pawn and potentially support a future attack on black's queenside. This move prepares to challenge white's queen and develop the bishop to a more active square, while also reinforcing the e6 pawn. This move, RFD1, aims to activate the rook onto the semi-open d-file, reinforcing control of the central square and preparing for potential operations in the center or kingside attack. This move 13, nc5, aims to centralize the knight, pressuring white's queen and preparing to attack the c4 pawn, creating dynamic counterplay in the Sicilian Najdorf variation. This move repositions the queen to a safer square, eyes the potentially weak d6 pawn, and prepares to support a central pawn push like e5. This move develops the queen to a central square, supporting the knight on c5 and preparing to connect the rooks, while also eyeing potential tactical possibilities on the c-file. This move, 15, Rack 1, prepares to activate the rook on the semi-open c-file, supporting a potential c5 pawn push and putting pressure on black's queenside. This move reinforces control over the c-file and prepares to contest it with white's rook, a common strategic battle in this Sicilian dragon, accelerated dragon-type structure. This knight repositioning to b1 aims to reroute the knight to c4 or d2, supporting the queenside pawns and potentially reinforcing the central control from a more stable position. This move activates the knight towards the center, challenging white's queenside pieces and preparing to contest the d5 square. This knight repositioning aims to reinforce the d4 square and potentially reroute to f3 or c4, supporting a central pawn push or preparing for tactical operations. This move repositions the knight to a more central square, preparing to challenge white's control of d5 and potentially support a queenside expansion with b5. This move prepares to reinforce the queenside pawn structure and potentially expand with b4, preventing black's knight from advancing to c4. This move prepares to support the e-pawn and potentially create counterplay on the kingside or center, while also connecting the rooks for future action. This move aims to gain queenside space and potentially open lines for white's pieces, challenging black's control of the b6 square and preparing for further pawn advances. This move prepares to redeploy the knight to a more active square, potentially f5 or d5, while also reinforcing the e4 pawn indirectly. This move prepares to support a potential kingside pawn advance or to defend against black's increasing pressure on the queenside and center. This move aims to redeploy the knight from a somewhat passive square to a more active position, preparing for potential central pawn breaks and supporting the f6 knight. The queen repositions to b1, likely aiming to support a potential c4-c5 pawn push or prepare for other queen maneuvers while keeping the queenside pawns defended. This move prepares to contest the now open c-file, aiming to exploit black's slightly underdeveloped queenside by activating the bishop. The knight maneuvers to a4 to prepare for future advances on the queenside, potentially targeting squares like b6 or c5 and challenging black's control of the queenside. The move rb8 supports the pawn on b6 and prepares to contest the open c-file, potentially creating counterplay along the queenside. The bishop retreats to f1 to unblock the d1 rook and prepare for potential central action, while also defending the g2 square against any aggressive knight maneuvers. This move aims to prevent white from exploiting the g-file with a rook sacrifice and also prepares to reinforce the kingside if white decides to advance pawns there. This move prepares to create space on the kingside for the g-pawn to advance. potentially supporting a kingside pawn storm or creating an escape square for the king. This move repositions the knight to a more central square, aiming to improve its defensive capabilities and prepare for potential central pawn breaks later in the game. The bishop repositions to g2, reinforcing the central pawn structure and preparing to castle queenside if black commits to an attack on the kingside, while also eyeing the long diagonal. This move repositions the rook to the more active c-file, eyeing potential exchanges or pressure against white's queenside pawn structure. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to contest control of the d5 square and potentially support a kingside initiative or prepare for a central pawn break. This move repositions the queen to a more active diagonal, preparing to contest the c-file and potentially support a queenside expansion with b5. Ka2 activates the queen to defend the a3 pawn and eye the central squares, preparing for potential pawn advances or piece redistribution. The queen repositions to a more active square, supporting potential pawn advances on the queenside and preparing to contest the d-file should it open. This move initiates a pawn break in the center, aiming to open lines and create attacking chances, likely preparing for a further advance or a pawn sacrifice to gain initiative. This move solidifies black's queenside pawn structure, aiming to prevent white's c5-c6 advance and create potential counterplay along the b-file. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, preparing to contest the central pawn tension and potentially support a future pawn push or knight outpost. The knight repositions to f6, reinforcing the central squares and preparing to potentially challenge white's pieces or switch to a more active attacking role on the kingside. The move qb1 prepares to transfer the queen to the kingside, likely aiming to support an attack on the g6 knight or to reinforce the kingside pawn structure, should black attempt to break through there. This pawn push aims to disrupt white's central control and potentially open lines on the kingside, creating play where black has been relatively passive. This move na5 is an attempt to exploit the light squares on the queenside and potentially force the black queen to move from its central post, though it also ventures the knight to a potentially vulnerable square. This capture opens up the c-file, creating tactical possibilities for white to exploit the d6 pawn and potentially attack the uncastled black king. This pawn capture opens the b-file for white's rook, creating immediate pressure along the semi-open file and challenging black's control of the c5 square. This move challenges white's pawn structure and opens lines for black's pieces, aiming to create counterplay on the kingside and exploit the weakened pawn chain. This pawn push disrupts black's attacking aspirations on the kingside and aims to create counterplay, potentially by opening the g-file or creating weaknesses around black's king. This move aims to improve the knight's position, potentially challenging white's control of the central squares and preparing for a future kingside attack or maneuver to the c4 square. This exchange removes black's strong knight on f4, opening lines for white's pieces and simplifying the position to white's advantage. Capturing the bishop with the queen regains material and opens lines for black's counterplay, but it invites white's queen to become more active. This knight maneuver repositions the piece to a more central and active square, aiming to support a potential pawn break or contest key squares in the center and kingside. The move 35, qc7 repositions the queen to a more active square on the c-file, potentially preparing to contest the open file or offer support to the d-pawn if it advances. The move 36, qb4 seeks to activate the queen to a more central square, preparing to potentially attack weaknesses on the queenside or support an advance of the b-pawn. The move nxe4 is a tactical blunder, allowing white to recapture with the bishop on e4, which develops a piece and opens the g1a7 diagonal for the queen, while black has sacrificed a pawn for no compensation. This move exchanges white's potentially vulnerable bishop for black's knight, simplifying the position and removing an active attacking piece from the center. This move recaptures a pawn, but more importantly, it repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to challenge white's control of the queenside and potentially create counterplay along the long diagonal. The exchange of queens after white's recaptures on e4 significantly simplifies the position, leading to a rook and pawn endgame where black's pawn majority on the queenside offers good winning chances. This move wins a pawn, but it exposes black's king and creates significant weaknesses around it by opening the a-file and potentially allowing white's queen to become very active on the queenside. This move stakes a strong claim on the critical c6 square, preventing black's knight from occupying it and creating a passed pawn that will demand significant attention from black's pieces. The capture of the bishop on a3 removes white's defender of the c6 pawn, allowing black to potentially create a passed pawn on the queenside if white recaptures with the knight. This move Ra1 aims to contest the open a-file, which is crucial for controlling the queenside and potentially supporting a queenside pawn advance, or attacking black's isolated c-pawn structure. Black recaptures the pawn on c6, re-establishing material equality and opening the c-file for potential counterplay against white's king. This move aims to recapture the pawn on c5 and simplify the position, potentially leading to an endgame where white may have an advantage due to the passed pawn on c6. This move, 41, b-flat 2, attempts to exploit the slightly vulnerable nature of white's queenside pawns and the misplaced knight on a4 by creating a passed pawn threat with the eventual advance of the queenside pawns and possibly utilizing the bishop's influence on the long diagonal.